So back at it with the security cameras, and we're going to continue working on the security terminal. So first let's make sure we are able to show the offline material when a camera is destroyed. So let's create a camera destroyed function or event. Create a custom event and call it camera destroyed. And we also need a few variables for this, so let's create a new variable. The first one is going to be isCurrentCam offline. That's a boolean, so that's fine. Then we also need an in-use variable, so let's create another boolean isInUse. So for this one we want to make sure that it's replicated, so on the right side set it to be replicated. And then I also want to get a user player controller in here, so user player controller, and that's going to be a first person controller. So we have those set up. Now let's start working on the event. So we have camera destroyed event. We need to get an input in here, and that's the camera blueprint. So the camera that is being destroyed. So let's get a camera BP, and that's the security camera. Oh, come on. Oh, really? So this one, finally, thank you. So let's add a branch in here. And first we want to check if the camera that is destroyed is the current camera that we're looking at. So let's get our camera array in here, the camera blueprints. Drag off here, let's get a find node, not a get node. So find item, and then we can plug in the camera blueprint from the event. So if this returns -1, then it's not in the array, and otherwise it's gonna return the array index. So let's get is greater than or equal to 0 node in here. And we also want to get an end node, and we want to know if that's the current index or not. So drag off here and do equal to, and if it's equal to our current index variable. So if it's bigger than -1 and if it's in the array, then we're gonna continue. And we're gonna set to our current camera offline. So drag in a setter and make sure that it's set to offline. And then we want to change the screen materials, but we need a multicast event for that. So I'm gonna create a custom event. No, not a comment. A custom event, and that's going to be the multicast set screen material. And I'll get back to this in a little bit. So first let's just call it over here. So MC set screen material. And for this we want to get a boolean as an input in here. So I'm gonna drag it on here so we have a variable in place. And then we can simply drag on the variable like this. So we have an input over here as well. Then we want to get a branch in here, and we want to know if the terminal is being used or not. So the camera can be active, so it's on the screen, but it doesn't mean that the terminal is actually used. So we're going to determine that as well. So for some reason this went to false when I plugged it in here, so make sure it's set to true. Let me double check. So if the terminal is in use, we want to know if the user is a local player or not. So we're going to drag in our user player controller, and we're going to do a isLocal controller check. So isLocal controller, or local player controller rather, and plug this into another branch over here. So if we are the local controller, that means we are the server, because we're only doing things on the server. We made sure that we did that. So we're gonna call our show offline screen, and that's a variable that's in our player controller. So we can drag off here and show offline screen. So we can call it directly because we are the server. and we can plug in the isCurrentCamera offline variable. And for clients, we want to call the client version, so drag off the controller and look for client show offline screen. Plug it into the false pin and again get your isCurrentCamera offline variable in. And then we should be good to go over here. So we need to create our multicast event. That's going to change the screen material, and it's going to change it from the offline material back to the render target or the other way around. So let's get a branch in here and connect this up. So let's get the screen in here as well. And then we simply want to set the material. And we're going to do that for the true and for the false pin. So if the camera is offline, we're going to show our camera offline material. So that's this one. And if it's true, we're going to drag in our screen material instance. So you want to get the material instance in here to make sure that it's actually working. And let's make sure that the event itself is set to a multicast event. And then we should be good to go over here. I think that should work. So let's create an interact event and an exit terminal event, so we can start interacting with it actually. That would be nice, to be honest. So let me see in my notes, let me get the correct event up. So we had the interaction interface in place, so we can simply get the interface event. So that's the interact with actor event. Interact with actor. There we go. No, not the message. So maybe we didn't implement the interface yet. So let's go to the class settings over here and let's add our interact interface. And now if we compile and save, we can get the interact with actor. So event interact with actor. That's the one we need. And first we're going to check again if we are the server or not. So only the server is going to do stuff. Is server. And then we want to know if we are already in use or not. So let's get another branch in here and let's get our in use variable in here. So is server is true. If we are in use is false, then we're going to store our user player controller. So get a setter in here. Get the is false pin and let's connect up the user controller from the interact event. So we made sure that when we enter the trigger over here, that on the player it's going to set the interactable actor variable. So we have our player over here. If we enter the trigger from the security terminal, it's going to set the interactable actor to the terminal, and then we are able to press F on it because it's valid, and it's going to interact with it through the interface event. So that's how we set it up. So we stored our user player controller. Let's make sure that we set our in use variable to true as well, so that matches. Then we want to disable all the hints for all other players, so we're going to show all hints. And let's make sure it's set to false, so we're not showing them. Then we are also want to disable the other terminals, but we do not have a function for it yet, so let's create a custom event. Here we go again. So custom event, and that's going to be disable all other terminals. And for now, we are simply going to call this over here. So disable all other terminals. And we'll get back to it in a little bit. So now we need to get another branch check in here. And we want to know if the camera is our current index and if it's destroyed or not. So if we want to show the offline screen or if we want to show the actual camera. So if we start interacting with it, the camera that is currently online, we need to make sure that it shows appropriately on the HUD widget. So we're going to do that by getting the camera array. get the current index and check if it's destroyed or not. So this is the camera that we're checking. Get is destroyed. Plug it into the branch over here. So if it is destroyed, we're going to set our current camera offline variable to true, and otherwise it's going to be false. And then we're going to call our multicast event, so the screen material event that we recently created. So MC set screen material, and do that for both of them. And we can plug in the boolean like this, so that should work. And then we also want to change the render target for the UI, but we also need to create that function, so let's do that later. Let's just create a custom event and say set UI render target. And let's call it from here. So set UI render target. And then we want to make sure that we are a local controller. So we're going to add another branch in here, and we're going to check from our user player controller is local player controller. So if we are local, we are the server. We determined that previously. So we are simply going to get our player controller and set our security terminal. No. That's security terminal. So because we are the server, we can do that directly. And for the clients, I created the header in the event previously. So when we were creating these UI events over here, for the show security screen, I had this security terminal setter for clients in here. So that's where clients will set it, and the server will set it directly over here. So then we're going to show our security screen widget. So again, that's on the controller. So show security screen widget blueprint, and make sure that it's visible. And then we also want to update the camera name. So again, that's on the controller, update camera name. We are the server, so we can call the normal version. And for the camera name, we're going to get our camera array, get the current index, and from there get the camera name. So I don't think we created that yet. So let's go back to our cameras folder, and for the security camera, no, we didn't add it yet. So let's create a new variable, and that's going to be our camera name. That's going to be a name variable. And we want to make sure that it's instance editable. And then we should be good to go. So now we can give each camera its own name. And from the security terminal, we should be able to get it now. So get camera name, there we go. Plug that into the node over here. And then we want to show the proper material. So set our offline screen material. Show offline screen, that's what we need to look for. And we are simply going to plug in our isCurrentCamera offline variable. So if it's offline, it's going to show the offline material, otherwise it's going to show the render target material. And now we need to do the same stuff for clients. So first we're going to show our client security screen widget, and by calling that function, we're going to set the security terminal variable like I showed. So let's call our client function, and we need to do that from the controller. So client show security screen. Let's make sure it's visible, and let's connect our security terminal. So that's going to be this blueprint. So that's a reference to 12. And then we want to do the same stuff as above. So we want to set our camera name and the show offline screen, but we want to call the client versions. So client set camera name, or update camera name, that is. And the target is the player controller. So let's make this a little bit less messy. And then we can simply get it from this getter, that doesn't matter. And for the show offline screen, let's drag off and look for the client version. So show offline screen. And again, let's get the variable in place here. So we should be good to go, and that should work. Now we have two functions left here that we need to create as well. So for the disable all other terminals, that shouldn't be too hard. Let's do that one first. So let's get a for each loop in here, and for the array of all security terminals, connect it up, come on to the execution. And first we want to make sure that it's not this security terminal, so we do not want to mess with ourself. So that's not equal, and let's get a self reference and make sure we connect it to branch up here. So if it's not self, then we want to know if we want to disable the terminal or not. So we need to add a boolean or a variable to the function, and let's call this disable terminals. So if it's true, we want to disable them, and otherwise we want to enable them. And I'm simply gonna get our box trigger in here and set the relative location. And I'm just gonna drop them 10,000 units if we're not using them, and otherwise I'm gonna put them back in the original position. So I might want to do add relative location. That's probably a better idea. So let's do add relative location. And for the true pin, I'm going to do minus 10,000. And for the false pin, I'm going to do plus 10,000. So we have our security triggers enabled or disabled. But we do not want to plug in the trigger from the components, obviously. We want to get our array element and then get the trigger from there. That's probably a better idea. So get trigger component, and let's plug that in here. And that should be better. Okay, so we have the disable terminals done. And now we need to set the proper UI render target. So this is mainly for if we have multiple terminals in the level and we want to access one terminal, then we're going to switch the UI render target because we can't get the dynamic materials working on there. So that's why we need this function. And first I want to know if we want to render it to the UI material or to the default material. So I'm going to say is UI render, and that's a boolean. Get a branch in here, plug it in. So if it's a UI render, I want to set the UI texture render target. So I'm going to get my screen material instance, and I'm going to say set texture parameter value, texture parameter value, connect it up, and then I'm going to drag in my UI texture render target, but we don't have that variable yet, I think. No, we only have the normal one, so I'm going to duplicate the normal one, and that's going to be my UI texture render target. But for this one, I'm going to disable instance editable, and I'm just going to set it to our UI render target by default, and plug that in over here. And for the parameter value, I need to double check my material. So let's get to the terminal screen material. And that's the screen render target parameter. So I'm going to copy and paste this. So now it's set to our UI render target, and then we want to do the same for the cameras that belong to this. So I'm gonna get a for each loop and plug in my cameras. And first I'm gonna check if the camera is destroyed or not, because then it shows another material, so I don't want to mess with it. So get is destroyed. Plug it in the branch over here. And if it's not destroyed, I want to make sure that I am the server. Is server. And if I am the server, then I'm gonna set the scene capture component to use the UI render target. So we may need a little bit more room over here. Drag off my array element over here, and I'm gonna get the scene capture component. For the scene capture component, I'm gonna drag off and set the texture target. And I need to plug this into the true pin, and the texture target is going to be the variable that we just created. So that's the UI texture render target. And now that should work, I think. So we need this plugged into the false pin, obviously. So if it's not destroyed, and if we are the server, then we should be good to go. And we need to make sure that this is a multicast event. So that's why I added the isServer check over here. So we did everything on the server, but over here we're calling a multicast event. So we need to filter out the clients again. That's why I add the server check in here. And now for the other pin, we want to do the same thing kinda in reverse. So I'm gonna copy this. And for the target, I'm gonna drag in the normal texture render target. And then for the for each loop, I think we can do the same thing. Yes, we can. So let's just copy and paste all of this. And over here, we're gonna drag in the normal texture render target again. So like this, instead of the UI texture render target. And then we should be good to go over here. So these events were already linked up over here, so that should be good. Let me think, what can we do? Can we check if this is working? Well, we can't really interact with it because we didn't set up any keybinds yet, but maybe we can see if anything shows up or not. So at least we have our hint that shows up. But the texture render target isn't working because the camera screen isn't updating, so something is wrong, and we get an error as well. So let me dive into that quickly. Okay, so I didn't actually break anything. This was supposed to happen. So we added the array of camera blueprints to our security terminal, and now we need to define what cameras belong to that terminal. So if we go into our viewport and we select the terminal that's in our map, then we can tell the array over here in the details panel. So let's click the plus sign over here, and with the little eyedropper we can select the camera. So now this camera belongs to this terminal, and if we check it out now, then the render target is working again. So now it shows up on the screen. And we have the hint showing up, so that part is working. So let's create the event for exiting the terminal as well. So let's go back to the terminal blueprint, and we want to create another custom event and call that exit terminal. And again, I'm gonna add a branch check to see if I am the server. So branch is server. And if we are the server, we're going to set the in-use variable back to false. And we're also going to remove the user player controller. So let's drag that in as well, where it's at, over here. And just plug in empty setters, so those will get reset. Then we're going to get the show all hints function. And we're going to enable all hints again. So make sure they are visible. Then we want to make sure that our UI render target is not set to UI. So let's set UI render target and make sure it's set to false. So we're not rendering to the UI target. And then we're going to enable all terminals again. So call the disable all terminals function and make sure that it's set to false. So we are enabling the other terminals again. So that's all we need to do for the exit terminal. And now I think we can start working on adding some keybinds to actually use this. So first I'm going to create an enumeration in here. So in the content browser, go to blueprints and create an enumeration. And I'm going to call this player input type enum. Input type enum. Open it up. And I'm going to add 3 enumerators in here. So click new 3 times. The first one is going to be character. The second one is going to be security interface. And the third one is going to be camera. So this enumeration is going to determine what is going to happen with my input, if I'm controlling the character, if I'm interacting with the terminal, or if I'm actually controlling a camera. So that's what we're deciding over here. So let's close our enumeration. And then first let's go to our first person character and let's create a variable in here that's going to be our input type. And that's the enum that we just created. So the player input type enum. So by default it's set to character, that's fine. And now what we want to do in here is go through all of our input events and make sure that we select the proper input. So over here we all want to connect them up to the player input. So for example, for the move forward, I'm going to add in a switch on enumeration. So switch on player input type enum. And create a bit of room in here. And I'm only going to connect up the player pin over here. So if we have our input set to any of the other ones, this is not going to do anything. And only if I set my input to character, then I'm going to be able to control my character. So drag in your input type variable over here. And then you want to make sure that you do that for all of the input types in the character. And then we are going to continue in the player controller. So I'm going to pause the video and get back in a little bit. So for all the input events in your player character, make sure you add this switch and only connect up the character to the original function. Be back in a little bit. So I'm back and I have everything in place. So make sure for the interact event that we added that you also add the switch on enum. And if you have events where you have a key release, so for example for the ADS events, you don't want to add it for the release event, only for the pressed event. So for my ADS and for my fire events, I only add it to the button pressed. So with that in place, we should be good to go, and we can go to our first person controller and we're going to add some stuff in here. So first let's build of our begin play function, and we want to get our possessed pawn. So let's get a little delay in here. And then I want to get my possessed pawn. So get get controlled pawn, I'm sorry. Get controlled pawn, there we go. So I'm going to cast this to the first person character, and then I'm going to store this as my possessed pawn. So that's why I was confused. So possessed pawn. So we are doing this on begin play because we want to get the client version, because we're going to work with the HUD and stuff like that. So if we get our event possess in here, we are going to only store it on the server and it's not of any use. So make sure you get the event begin play, and that's why we add a little wait. So it's actually possess the pawn and let's get the pawn. So that's what we did over here. Then we're going to create an event to change our input type. So let's get a custom event and then let's call it change input type. and that's going to have a variable, and that's of our input type enumeration. So let's create one, and that's our input type, and that's the player input type enum. So first I want to add a delay in here, and that's going to be a delay of world delta seconds. So the reason I'm adding this is when I exit the terminal and I use the same key to switch my weapon, for example, then I don't want the character to switch weapon as well while I'm exiting the terminal. So if I add a world delta seconds delay, then it will fix that dual input. So that's why we have a tiny delay in here. And then I'm also going to create the input type variable on my player controller. So promote to variable, and that's my input type. And we're going to set it over here, so that's fine. Connect them up to the delay. And make sure that for your possessed pawn you also set the correct input type. So get your possessed pawn in here and set the input type. And make sure that it's set to the new one that came from the event. So for now we can leave this alone, and we'll get back to this in a little bit later. We need to make sure that if we go to our security screen function where we show the widget for the security screen, that we add the switch for the input type in here as well. So we're gonna drag off here, and now we can call the function to change the input type. And if we show the HUD, we want to change the input type to our security interface, and if we leave the HUD, we want to change it to our character, and then connect it back up to the isValid node. So now if we open our security screen widget, we're going to put the input type to our security interface. And if we exit the widget, it's going to go back to our controller. So that should work. And now we can add a quit event, and then we can test a little bit, I think. So let's just do that. I'm gonna add keyboard events and not create key binds. So in a player controller you can also use the input, but make sure when you create this that you disable consume input over here. So otherwise the input won't reach your pawn, and if you use the same buttons it won't work. So make sure to disable consume input. And then we're gonna create the quit event. So first of all, I'm gonna get my input type in here, and I'm gonna switch on it. So that tells me if I'm in the interface widget or if I'm controlling a camera, so I can use this that way. So right now we do not have camera control set up yet, so I'm gonna leave it alone, and I'm just gonna use the middle pin. So first I want to know if I'm the server or not, so has authority. If I am the server, I can simply call my exit terminal event, and otherwise I need to call the replicated version, and for that I think we need to create those. So let me see. Did we already create an exit terminal event? Yes, we did. Okay, so we can go back to our controller over here, and we can simply call that. So let's get our player controller in here, and we are the player controller, so we want to get the security terminal in here, and then we're going to call our exit terminal function. And we do not have a client version for this yet, because we need to create it over here on the first person controller, because if we create it on the security terminal it won't work, because the server owns that actor. So if you try to replicate it from an actor that you don't own, it's not going to work. So we need to make sure that we are on the player controller and then create the replicated event. So let's create a custom event, and that's going to be server exit terminal. And this needs to be set to run on server. So replicated run on server. And this is going to call the exit terminal event on the security blueprint. So we want to add the security blueprint as an input over here. And let's call this security BP. That's the security terminal blueprint. And we can call our exit terminal function from here. And then clients can call that function from here, server exit terminal. And we need to make sure that we plug in our security terminal like this. Now we're going to reset the security terminal variable itself in the player controller. So just drag in an empty setter. And we're going to make sure that we stop showing the widget. So let's get the function in here. And let's set visibility to false. And that should work. So right now, because this is an input event, we are always the local player. So we can simply call this. We don't need to check for anything else. So that should do it. Let me think. So we might actually be able to test if this is working or not. So let's just do it. I'm going to walk up to this, and if I press F, well, something shows up. Okay, let me double check. Okay, so a few small things. For the setUI render target function call over here, we need to make sure that we set it to true. So change that. So we're in the interact event over here in the security terminal. And there you have the call setUI render target, and you need to make sure this is set to true. Then we also need to go to the first person controller, and I forgot to set the client show security screen to replicate run on owning client. So make sure you set that one as well. Show security screen in the player controller, run on owning client. And then we also need to go to the first person character and make sure that your interactable actor variable is replicated. So select the interactable actor variable, and on the right side over here, set it to be replicated. And then after you did that, it should work. So now we can walk up to the interface and we can interact with it, and we can see the camera on the screen. So it's focusing on the client right now, so you can see that. And if we press Q, we're going to exit the terminal and we're going to be able to back out. And the same thing goes for the client, so he should be able to interact with it. We get a hint over here, we can interact with it. It's still focused on me, so it's not moving. So let's get out of the way, and it starts moving again. And if I interact, you can see on the screen it's also still moving. And for the host on the screen, it's also still showing the correct screen. So that's working. Now you can see the image is quite blurry and not really of a great quality. So if we go into our cameras folder, we have the texture render targets over here, and we can adjust the size. So I set this first one to be 1280 by 720, but I didn't do that for the UI one. So we want to go into the UI one and also increase the scale over here. So then you should have a sharper image. And now we could also try and see what happens if we shoot a camera. So let me just look at it over here, and then I'm going to grab the client and I'm going to try and destroy it and see if everything happens the way it should. And obviously it doesn't. So we do not get our offline screen material. So let me dive into that. Okay, so I'm back. So first of all, the current index variable, we need to make sure that it's replicated. And we need to do the same thing for the all security terminals array. So make sure those two variables are set to replicate. And for the entire blueprint for the terminal, we also want to make sure that it replicates. So go to the class defaults and make sure that you enable replicates over here as well. So that should solve a whole bunch of problems. and then all we need to do is add a call to our camera destroyed event in the camera blueprint. So if we go to our security camera blueprint, and there we have the event destroyed over here, where we destroy the camera, and we want to make sure that we let the terminal know that we destroy the camera if we do so. So after the MC destroyed camera call, we're going to add a call to our camera destroyed event. So drag in your owning terminal variable and simply call the camera destroyed event and hook in a reference to self for the camera blueprint. So now this event actually gets called, and now everything should work. So if I'm looking at a screen and another player shoots at it, it should disappear. So client is watching the camera and the server is shooting at it. And now you can see all screens match and the screen disappeared. And if I press Q, I can exit the widget and I can go back to the game. So I think everything is working. I'm gonna do a little bit more testing, and if I run into any problems, I'll let you know in the next episode. And we'll also get back to finishing the player control for the camera, and that's going to be the last episode as well. So thanks for watching, and talk to you later, guys. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video or you think you might have learned something, please consider leaving a like. I'll be back for more.